What is Jesus doing in Luke 4, verse 18? What's Jesus doing in Luke 4, verse 18? In the synagogue reading, and where is He reading from? From Isaiah chapter 61. So the 18th verse, Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. And no one had a problem with that, but then what did He do? Okay, He closed the book, gives it to the attendant, and everyone is looking on Him. And He said, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." So all bore witness to Him and marveled at the gracious words which proceeded out of His mouth. And what did they ask? Isn't this Joseph's son? So we begin to see the problem, and it's actually a very enlightening problem that the Lord brings up about the way that He was perceived, but as it turns out, it's pretty universal. So, how did they view Him? How did they view Him? As just ordinary. Okay, Jesus was composed of two different, and you have to be careful how you word this, because I don't want to give a wrong impression, and it's already hard enough to explain anyway. But Jesus was not an ordinary man. What was He? He was God and man. And explaining that is a difficult proposition. But explaining this is pretty easy. How did they view Him? They saw the what? They saw the man part, but they didn't what? They didn't see the God. And already just in the area, He had already been either working miracles, or there could have been plenty of just talk about what He had been doing, but they only saw Him as what? As ordinary. They just saw Him as a regular person. So He said to them, "You will surely say this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself. Whatever we have heard done in Capernaum, do also here in your country.' Then He said, 'Assuredly I say to you, no prophet is accepted in his own country.'" And that's the proverb that still to this day remains to be true. Isn't that correct? It really is. Now, I wouldn't say that if a famous person came from Lufkin and they came back to Lufkin, I mean, you would what? You would be somewhat kind of awestruck. You might want to autograph or something like that. But largely, how would you remember that person? As one of us, as if it was someone, Lufkin's produced a couple or three NFL players over the last several years. How would you think about them? That was just the kid that I went to see on Friday nights and watch him play. So there's definitely, when someone's from a particular place, you definitely kind of deprecate them. And that continues on to this day. And this is what Jesus is saying to them. But the message that Jesus had is far more important than just fame or celebrity. He's trying to actually teach them something that's going to save their lives. So He tells them in verse 25, "But I tell you truly, many widows that were in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a great famine throughout all of the land. But to none of them was Elijah sent except to Zarephath in the region of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow." Okay, so basically to what kind of widow? great famine throughout all the land, but what kind of widow? Basically a Gentile widow. In 27, and many lepers were in Israel in the time of Elijah the prophet, and none of them were cleansed except who? A Syrian. So now, he said, so all of those in the synagogue, when they heard these things, were filled with wrath. So they had reached a point. Jesus is claiming to be divine. And they just couldn't do what? They just couldn't wrap their heads around that because He was the carpenter's son. He also, in what He was doing, they couldn't outright reject Him because they're seeing it what? I mean, they're seeing it with their own eyes. So they can't accept Him on one hand, and they can't reject Him on the other. So apparently there's only one alternative left. And that's to what? To get mad at Him and kill Him. So that's apparently the only alternative left. They can't accept Him on one hand, they can't reject Him on the other hand, so they just get angry. And in verse 29, they rose up and they thrust Him out of the city, and they led Him to the brow of a hill on which their city was built, that they might throw Him down over the cliff. Then passing through the midst of them, He went on their way, or on His way. So just a pretty amazing scene of Jesus. And as I had mentioned last week, some see this is like the latest episode that you could have selected to say this is the life of, this is where Jesus' ministry begins. But in Nazareth, you have people who already can see what He's doing, they just can't accept it. So here's what He gets for being a good son, a model citizen for 30 years. I mean, this was not a 12-year-old. This was someone who had lived there for 30 years. And they were wanting to what? Just kill Him. Just kill Him. I mean, people can be callous and cold-hearted, especially when you get them in a what? When you get them in a mob mentality. When you get them in a mob mentality. And we have proof of that over and over and over again. I mean, even just in the last month or two, people in mob mentalities will just kill people at will. So here they were about ready to do this with Jesus, but I'll just say in verse 30, but passing through the midst, there are a lot of people, and I put it in the notes, there's some people who believe that this meant a miracle. I don't really know if it did or not. I would only say that it didn't require a miracle. Him passing through their midst just meant that He could have found a way to kind of skirt around them and get out of the difficulty, the danger, and then just move on. So it didn't necessitate a miracle, and it doesn't really specifically lay out the concept of a miracle. But this is the reception that He sees in Nazareth. Now, I have no idea if this is what drives Him or not, but once He leaves Nazareth, He what? He doesn't what? He doesn't come back. The Gospels don't record Him coming back to Nazareth, at least not that I could recall. So once He leaves here, he's left for good. But let's see where He goes. Matthew chapter 4 and verses 13 through 16. So Matthew chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. Now, in the context of Matthew chapter 4, this is taking place right after what? Right after His temptations. Yes, right after His temptations. The temptations end in 11. So 12, now when Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he departs to Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is by the sea, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and upon those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. So we need to explain that. But first, I'll just give you, this will be the last time we go over it, just some quick pictures of Capernaum. And remember, Capernaum was right on the sea, right on the seashore. And you can see this. I would just bring up, just note again, this is going to be relevant very soon. This is a Catholic church. And what does that Catholic church sit on top of? What does that Catholic church sit on top of? Because right here's the synagogue. And again, it's not a first century synagogue. They think they've dated it to the 4th or 5th century. But the architecture is still good for us learning what it would have looked like. So this Catholic church sits on top of Peter's mother-in-law's house. Or at least what is the traditional site of Peter's mother-in-law's house. And remember, I told you, and you can barely make it out, that the church is set up on support so that it's lifted above the actual ruins. So when you look at it this way, you can kind of see the light through it. These are the actual, or they claim, are the actual ruins of the house itself. The house could have looked something very similar to this, or something that was very similar to this. Because it was in Capernaum, what does the prophecy call it? Galilee of what? Galilee of the Gentiles, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But Galilee of the Gentiles, as you might imagine, it would have lots of superstition because it's got lots of religion that's certainly not the Old Testament religion, but would be pagan religion. So this is just one little item. There's a ton of them out there. But this is just one little item. It's an amulet that was worn to ward off evil spirits. So a superstitious Gentile, not a God-fearing place. Why was it like that? Because we still think of it as being the land of Canaan, but it is very far what? Very far north. Very far north. In fact, so far north that you could look at it a couple of different ways. It was so far north that centuries and centuries ago, the Canaanite people weren't completely exterminated out of the land. Or it's so far north that you've got Gentile people who are coming south down into the land to live there, which honestly makes more sense a little bit to me, because in order to live anywhere, what have you got to have? Water. And so if you're choosing a place to go and live, where are you going to live? By a humongous lake, which is actually called the Sea of Galilee. 13 miles by 7 miles. I mean, really, really big. So you had these people who came, I think what was more likely, who came south and began to live there. And in this prophecy, this particular one, in verse 15, by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, some scholars believe that was an indication of trade routes. So that was essentially a description of trade routes. And you have these people also, if you think about 700 years prior to this, in the land of Israel, they were taken into Assyrian captivity. And the people up by the Sea of Galilee would have been the first ones to what? to kind of get it, to have war kind of brought into their region, first to be attacked, the first to be probably carried off into captivity. And I think that begins to explain more of verse 16 here. And the people who sat in darkness, it wasn't like living in Jerusalem. It was different. So the people who sat in darkness, what did they have? They had a great light. And upon those who sat in the region and the what? Shadow of death. And again, why could it be a shadow of death? Well, it could have been a shadow of death because, again, when the Assyrians came down to take them away, a very violent removal of the people, so that shadow of death. So in this shadow of death, light has what? Light has dawned. Why does he go to Galilee? To this prophecy, why does he go to Galilee? They desperately what? They needed the physician, right? They needed the gospel. And remember, and we do need to remind ourselves as we go through the study, what are the Gospels for? What are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for? They're for the retelling of the account, not specifically of the life of Jesus so that we would know about Him biographically, but of the telling of the life of Jesus so that we would know what? Yeah, so that we would know how the gospel was spread to all different kinds of it. That's what the gospel, that's what the good news was. It wasn't just merely facts about His life, but it was a culmination of the gospel going to these different places. And here it needed to go in the north. Why? Because they were people who desperately needed it. Okay, let's look in Luke chapter 5 and beginning in verse 1. Because now we've reached a point where Jesus needs what? He needs some helpers. So a great question is, did He not have them to this point? He did have them. Okay, so what did He not have to this point? He didn't have men who what? They weren't full-time. So they weren't fully committed yet to being disciples. And without kind of that knowledge, it seems like the selection of Jesus' disciples seems confusing because you've got followers. In fact, we've already looked at John chapter 1. John chapter 1 talks about the first selecting of the four of them, but He wants them to follow Him. But now at this point, which we've had months that have gone by, now at this point, what does He need? Or what's He ready for? Men who are willing to, give up all and go and be with Him. And that's why I've selected Luke's account, because we get a little extra information. So it was, as the multitude pressed about Him to hear the word of God, that He stood by the lake of Gennesaret. And Gennesaret, of course, was the Sea of Galilee. Galilee's got a few names. We know it as the Sea of Galilee. Here Luke calls it the lake of Gennesaret. John calls it the Sea of Tiberias. In the Old Testament, it was called Chinnereth. So it just has a bunch of different names to it. And He saw two boats standing by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out from them and were washing their nets. Then He got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and He asked him to put it out a little from the land. And He sat down and He taught the multitudes from the boat. So the way Luke is recounting it, it's almost like Jesus and Peter don't know one another. But they've known one another for months now. Verse 4, when He had stopped speaking, He said to Simon, do what? Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. What was Peter? He was a fisherman. You generally don't have to do what? You generally don't have to tell a fisherman, especially a fisherman who made their living doing it. You don't have to tell them when and where to fish. They know it. Fish are very pattern oriented. They feed the same time every day. So Simon in verse 5 answered and said to him, Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, what? I'll entertain you. At your word, I will let down the net. And when they did it in 6, what happened? They caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And when they came and filled both boats, they began to what? They began to sink. That takes a lot. So if I understand it correctly, the species of fish that they caught were like tilapia. Now, if you ask me were they like the tilapia that we go and order today, I can't tell you. I can tell you with relative certainty that the size was about the same. So, if you've got enough fish to sink a wooden boat, okay, how many fish is that? It's a lot. Because even if you look at a dinky boat, and you've got just a dinky boat, surprisingly, if you talk about weight that's applied directly down to sink it, it takes an amazing amount of weight to sink a boat that way. Now, if you put a dinky boat out in the ocean, it's going to go down pretty fast. But just increasing the amount of weight to make it sink is a lot of weight. And that particular fish is not super big. We're not talking they were pulling in marlins or tunas. These fish were this big, something like this. So it probably is the catch of a lifetime. So they pull it in, the boat begins to sink. And what does Peter say in verse 8? Depart from me, for I am a sinful man. And it does make you wonder what, and this, I think it's great at explaining human nature. What was it about this miracle that made Peter react in this way? Okay, so this miracle really, really spoke to what? It spoke to his life, what he was, what he did. And it was something that wasn't just supernatural, but it was supernatural, and he could actually put and understand a scope of it. And it makes him react this way. I mean, quite honestly, in a very natural way. And that's the way a lot of times I think the gospel does actually affect people. They understand that it's beautiful teaching and that it's great teaching, but when it finally clicks somehow that it works in their life in a particular way, and sometimes that takes years, but when that finally happens, they're willing to actually turn and give their life to it. Just like Peter was here when he responds to depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. And even when you keep on going in verse 9, for he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on, you'll what? You'll catch men. And not only will you catch men, But again, the point of Him calling them is that they're going to do it now full time. So when they had brought their boats to land, they did what? They forsook all and they followed Him. Okay. They forsook all and they followed Him. I put here in your notes just a special point. God always calls the busy to do His will. You know, if you guys are going to hire someone and you've got a couple of candidates, one candidate is maybe a person that's come from a long-term employment, and I don't really know what you'd count as long-term employment in today's job market, but 5 years seems to be a pretty reasonable amount to be long-term now. Or you've got someone who hasn't worked in a while. Which one are you more likely to choose? If that's the only actual option if that's the only characteristic that you're judging, then which one are you likely to pick? The one that's what? The one that's working. Why would you do that? So first of all, they could have all kinds of different experience. And I mean, for those who have retired, you know, I've watched it with my children. Every preacher would tell you that working with the congregation is a relatively static thing. Lots of you have retired. I'll tell you that if we go back in my little imaginary time period to 5 years, that gets us back to what? COVID. Job market has changed extraordinarily in 5 years. And I've watched my children go through it. So to be able to navigate that and to navigate it somewhat successfully, you're more likely going to pick the one who has been busy at work. If that's your only consideration. Now, you've probably got 20 when you're actually looking to hire someone, and that may go out the window. But just in looking at that one, you're likely to weight that working pretty high. And I just mentioned here in the notes that God has called the busy to His business. Moses, Gideon, Saul, David, Elisha, Matthew, and Saul, when they were called because they were deep in their work. So when they were called, the answer was kind of unhesitating. They went and they did what God wanted them to do. Okay, so let's go to Mark chapter 1 now. Mark chapter 1, and looking at in Mark chapter 1, beginning in verse 21, because this is a very noteworthy event. Mark chapter 1, verse 21. Why do you think it's a noteworthy event? Why is it a noteworthy event? First of all, in 21, then they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath He entered the synagogue and taught. So this would have been the first Sabbath after He chose the fishermen, the four there. Why is this so special? It's the first time He what? It's the first time that He has any interaction with the spirit world. Okay? First time He has any interaction with the spirit world. Because He's already done what kind of healings? Physically sick, lepers. He's even done what in John chapter 2? He's even turned water into wine. But He hasn't done what yet? He hasn't fooled with demons yet. So Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 21, Went into Capernaum immediately on the Sabbath. He entered the synagogue and he taught. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them what? As one as having authority and not as the scribes. Just a little note, this was the same kind of astonishment as what happened as another point in Jesus' teaching, a much more famous point. That was a time where he was astonished. And then at the end of his teaching at the Sermon on the Mount, they were astonished. Why? Because he taught them with authority. So now here it's happening again. Someone who teaches them having authority, not as the scribes. In 23, now there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying what? Let us alone. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are. So the demons had the knowledge, this, of course, because they're all in the supernatural world. And what does he call him? The Holy One of God. And again, we actually read through that in Isaiah chapter 57, verse 15. This Holy One, Isaiah 57:15 was Holy One of Israel, but this Holy One of God is a similar statement to it. Just shows that the demon knew that Jesus was who? The Son of God. He could recognize the humanity and the divinity, not like the people in Nazareth could, but here was this demon. So Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." And when the unclean spirit had convulsed him and cried out with a loud voice, he came out of him. Then they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, "What is this? What new doctrine is this? For with authority he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And immediately his fame spread throughout all of the region around Galilee. It's the first time that this had happened, the first interaction with now this spirit world, and they were able to see what fact? That he had authority over them. And that is, ultimately, that was what the point is for Jesus, to establish authority. What did the miracles do? The miracles showed that what he had was authority when he preached and when he taught. So in casting out the demons, he shows he has authority. That authority being established, he's then able to go and continue on in his teaching and preaching. Okay, we will come back to Luke chapter 4 next time. That is where we will start looking at Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law.